in a violent coup d'etat on 18 September 1988. Japan showed some self-restraint in extending aid under pressure from the Western countries, especially the United States. Tokyo describes its Burma policy as one of quiet dialogue rather than sanctions or full engagement. The final period is from 2011 to now, the present, after the junta known as the State Peace and Development Council was dissolved. The inauguration of a new system of government under the 2008 Constitution occurred. Newly appointed President Thein Sein promoted significant political and economic reforms, and Japan dramatically increased ODA, including new yen loans. Now, looking first at the Japanese occupation, during this period, relations between Japan and Burma were primarily military and political in nature rather than economic. Although it was relatively short, 3 years, or a little over 3 years, the Japanese occupation had profound impacts on post-1945 Myanmar. The Japanese, for one thing, established the first modern Burmese armed force, the Burma Independence Army, training its officers, the 30 comrades, in occupied China on the eve of the war. By the late 1950s, the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar Armed Forces, were the most powerful institution inside of Myanmar. Weakened by British colonial rule, Burmese society was shattered by the Japanese invasion as the ethnic majority Burmans, or Bamars, generally supported the Japanese, while the minorities in the border areas and elsewhere, especially the Karens and the Kachins, remained loyal to the British colonialists. Communal violence occurred between Burmans and Karens and Burmans and Arakanese Muslims. Number 3 here, arms flowed into Burma with the foreign soldiers, and pocket armies emerged practically everywhere, causing a militarization of Burmese society that in one form or another has continued up until today, despite the ceasefires in the border areas after 1988. The wartime occupation of Burma is used by Japanese revisionist historians to claim that Japan's Greater East Asia War liberated the countries of Southeast Asia from white or European colonial exploitation. At the same time, the story of the 30 comrades and the independence struggle led by Aung San against, quote, the colonialist British and the fascist Japanese during the war has become a narrative that is central to independent Burma's national identity. Some ethnic minorities give similar status to their struggles alongside the British against the Japanese invaders, especially, I think, the Karens. Now we move on to the second period. Burma did not sign the San Francisco Treaty in 1951 because the UNU government felt that the treaty would compromise their fundamental commitment to neutrality and non-alignment because of Japan-US security ties. However, a bilateral treaty was signed between the Union of Burma and Japan in November of 1954. The terms of this treaty not only normalized diplomatic relations, but also provided war reparations from Japan, comprising $200 million in goods and services sourced in Japan, and $50 million in investment and technical aid. Additional war reparations of US 140, it says 140, it should be 140 million, were allocated during the 1965-77 period. Also, Burma was a source of much of Japan's rice in the immediate post-war period. Afterwards, of course, Japan adopted a rice self-sufficiency policy. War reparations, the first given by Japan to an Asian country, funded the Baluchong hydroelectric project in guerrilla-infested Karenni state, which provided Yangon with much of its electric power. As the project fell into disrepair during the UNU and the Slork periods, there were chronic power shortages throughout Burma and especially in Myanmar's capital. Also funded by reparations were the so-called four industrial projects. These were facilities assembling cars, trucks, agricultural machinery, and electric appliances, relying on made-in-Japan components provided by single-source contractors Mazda, Hino, Kubota, and Matsushita. This project was considered a failure by many observers inside Japan because the projects turned out low-quality products and remained dependent on Japan-supplied parts. Now we move on to the third period, the period of the socialist regime under Ne Win. General Ne Win, commander of the Tatmadaw, established a martial law regime consisting most of his fellow military officers on 2 March 1962. During this period, aid relations between Japan and Burma became close, with Japan by far the largest donor of ODA to the country. During 1980 to 88, Burma was always among the top 10 recipients of Japanese aid. Now, we all know Ne Win established a one-party state in which there were formerly two power centers. One was the Burma Socialist Program Party, and the other was the army itself. And it attempted to establish a socialist or Soviet-style, self-sufficient socialist economy. The real power structure in Burma during this time centered on Ne Win as a one-man ruler, a dictator. All decisions of importance were made by him, and colleagues who displeased him, usually by becoming too powerful or becoming too popular, were cashiered or jailed. For instance, Aung Ji and Tin U, who was head of military intelligence for a while. To number one, as Ne Win was called, all politics and diplomacy was personal, despite his socialist ideology. Because of erratic and often astrologically inspired policy making by number one, incompetent management by military officers who replaced professional civil servants in the state and state enterprises, and the ongoing civil war in the border areas, Burma became one of the poorest nations in Southeast Asia. Although Ne Win era Burma was a one-party socialist state with a centrally planned economy, capitalist Japan was allowed to play an important economic role through its reparations and ODA. In the Burmese case, the aid presence was not supplemented by significant bilateral trade outside of ODA-driven trade or Japanese private investment. And given the relatively small size and undeveloped nature of the Burmese economy at the time, the amount of Japanese aid was huge, especially in the 10 years preceding the 1988 political crisis. Aid continued to flow on a large scale, even when it became evident that the socialist economy had little or no prospect for reform or real development. Now, I have here some statistics. The amounts of ODA given by Japan to Myanmar between 1980 and 1988 in US $1 million, the single digits below are Myanmar's ranking as a recipient of Japanese aid. You see it was 4 in 1980, went down to 7 in 1984, up to 5 in 85 and 86. So it was always, at this time, in the top 10 of aid recipients. As a veteran of the 30 comrades who had been trained by the Japanese Army, comrades of Aung San, commander of the armed forces originally established by the Japanese, Ne Win made full use of his Japanese connections in the decades after the war, and reciprocally Japanese interests connected with ODA were assiduous in cultivating the man who, more than any other, was responsible for Myanmar's tragic slide into isolation, poverty, and civil war after the Socialist Revolution of 1962. Illustrative of this was Ne Win's award on 4th January 1981 of a decoration, the Order of Aung San, which was given to 7 members of the Minami Kikan, which was a Japanese Imperial Army organization that had been set up just before the war in order to train Burmese nationalists, including Aung San. So they received a special decoration from the Burmese government or from Ne Win for their efforts in securing Japanese independence. Securing Burmese independence. Then we move on to the next period. This is from 1988 to 2011, the SLORC or SPDC period. We have the establishment of a martial law regime taking place after much violence in the streets of Yangon and other cities. Among those who expressed their disapproval of the Army's behavior towards civilian protesters was Mr. Hiroshi Otaka, Japan's ambassador to Myanmar, who along with other ambassadors boycotted the regime's Independence Day celebrations on 4th January 1989 and broke with his old friend Ne Win. But on 17th February 1989, the Japanese government recognized the SLORC regime, although this caused criticism among Western nations. The decision to recognize the regime was based on Tokyo's principle of state-to-state rather than government-to-government relations. During 1989 to 2011, Myanmar experienced a rather uneven opening to the outside world. Aid and investment, including military aid, were provided by the more developed Southeast Asian countries such as Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia. And in 1997, Myanmar became a member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The People's Republic of China became the single largest source of aid and investment, again including military aid, motivated for the most part by Beijing's need for stable sources of raw materials, especially energy. Some observers feared that Myanmar was becoming an economic satellite of China. However, Western countries imposed sanctions on the military regime, especially the United States, but also the European Union. However, Japan followed what could be called a middle way of quiet dialogue. Although no new yen loans were allocated for the country after 1988, save in 1997, for repair of Yangon's airport, debt relief grants, grant aid, and technical assistance were given, and Japan sought to persuade the junta to carry out both political and economic liberalization in accordance with Tokyo's fundamental principles of ODA formulated in the early 1990s. Policymakers in Tokyo seemed confident that their special relationship with Myanmar, plus the large carrot of ODA, would alter the general's behavior for the better. Like their counterparts in the West, Japan's leaders frequently expressed their concern for the welfare of pro-democracy leader Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, who was placed under house arrest in 1989. The greatest success of quiet dialogue seems to have been the release of Daw Suu Kyi from house arrest in July 1995. The SLORC expected that in return, Japanese ODA would increase substantially, but in fact, Tokyo remained cautious. As she tried to create political space for her National League for Democracy party, and the junta wanted to stop that space from being created, Daw Suu Kyi went back under house arrest, as many of you know, in 2000 to 2002, and then again for a much longer period from 2003 until 2010. Myanmar Masatsu, which in Japanese means friction over Myanmar, was a major issue from time to time during this period. Washington tended to view Japan's policy towards the junta as excessively conciliatory. For example, in 2001, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell criticized Tokyo's grant to Myanmar to repair the Balutron hydroelectric plant, described as humanitarian aid, as not proper investment to be making at this time with this regime. Inside of Japan, there seemed to be a David and Goliath situation. Powerful business lobbies, represented by the Nihon Myanmar Kyokai, influential members of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, and individual spokesmen for Japanese business, such as Omai Kenichi, wanted full engagement with Myanmar economically and diplomatically. Opposed to this was a human rights lobby, including admirers of Aung San Suu Kyi, and at the time, in the 1990s and the early 21st century, she was extremely popular and well-known inside of Japan. NGOs such as Amnesty International Japan and Mekong Watch, and some opposition lawmakers. However, the human rights lobby had a very powerful ally in the United States, which imposed the stiffest sanctions against Myanmar. Japan could not afford to alienate its most important ally over the issue of this one Southeast Asian country. Now I move to the last period, a period of about, 4 years now, which I call, maybe controversially, the constitutional or post-junta period. In March 2011, the Constitution approved in a popular referendum in May 2008 came into effect. The SPDC was dissolved, and retired General Thein Sein became the president of the new Republic of the Union of Myanmar. Then there followed a series of rather surprising and, in general, unexpected reforms, which seemed to show that Myanmar was moving in the direction of democracy and economic liberalization. One was dialogue between President Thein Sein and Daw Suu Kyi that led to the inclusion of herself and the NLD in the political process. Another was the release of a majority of political prisoners from jail, including leaders of the 1988 movement, such as Min Ko Nang. Another is by-elections in April 2012, in which 45 constituencies in Myanmar were contested, and Daw Suu Kyi and 42 other members of the NLD were elected in a landslide. Another, Daw Suu Kyi's active participation in the parliamentary politics, the Union Parliament, including chairmanship of the legislators' Human Rights Commission, and other human rights measures, including a loosening of state control of the media. During 2012, Western countries, including the United States, dropped most of their sanctions, and Western leaders met President Thein Sein at international forums and in the new capital of Naypyidaw. Japan also increased its engagement now that Myanmar seemed to be firmly on the road to democracy and economic rationality. New loan projects were initiated, the most important being infrastructure development for the Thilawa Special Economic Zone south of Yangon, which also received investment from major Japanese corporations. During 2013-2014, yen loans for Thilawa totaled some 24.6 billion yen. Now, my last slide here and the closing of my presentation shows something of the rapid increase in Japanese aid to Myanmar after 2011. The middle row here is 100 million yen, units of 100 million yen given to Myanmar. And then below that, the bottom line is, just for comparison purposes, the amount of loan aid or ODA given to Vietnam, which I believe now is the #1 recipient, if I'm not mistaken. And you can see that while Vietnam is far ahead of Myanmar up until 2012, in Myanmar, all of a sudden the amount of Japanese funds going into Myanmar increases quite spectacularly. Okay, well, that is my presentation just to give you a historical overview. And at this time,